Hello, welcome to this week's recording for my reflections on 1 Corinthians. Still cold here in Florida as far as I'm concerned. I know it's not as cold as possibly where you are up north if you're watching from there. I record these ahead of time, so it might warm up by the time you're watching this, at least here in Florida. If you haven't already, please take a moment and go below this video on YouTube and subscribe. Also, give us a thumbs up on that. Click on that if you are finding these beneficial, and I encourage you, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, please leave them in the comment section below this video on YouTube, or share them with your friends if you feel like it. We just finished chapter 9, and if you haven't already, you're welcome to pause this video and read or listen to someone read to you chapter 10. I like to have the computer read to me for following along. In the end of chapter 9, Paul was talking about running the race, and he was referencing the Isthmian races, which the Corinthians would have been familiar with, sort of like our Olympics, but a little less variety. And he says that every runner runs to win, but they run to win a perishable reward, a perishable crown. And he says that he doesn't run around aimlessly. He has a goal in mind, and the goal is a non-perishable crown. That's the goal of every Christian, and we all can win. It's not just a participation crown, it's an actual crown that we will win when we run the race. And he talks about disciplining ourselves, and in that sense he says, I strike a blow to my body to make it a slave. After I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. So he's talking about that kind of discipline that athletes use to make sure they are in the best possible shape, and referencing that to say we Christians need to be in the best possible spiritual maturity kinds of shape, that is to be like Christ as much as we are able, and continue to work toward that goal of the non-perishable crown of glory. So picking up then at chapter 10, in this chapter, the Apostle Paul lifts up what happened to the chosen people of Israel. They were chosen because God sent Moses to them while they were in slavery in Egypt. They were chosen for freedom. So they always felt especially chosen by God rather than just random kinds of believers. So they were the chosen people of Israel, and yet they succumbed to temptation in the wilderness, and that's what Paul is going to be referencing here in this chapter. So he warns these Corinthian Christ followers against a false sense of security. Yes, they are Christ followers. Yes, they are believers. No, they are not. They're not immune to being tempted, and they're not immune to giving into those temptations. Just like the chosen people of Israel were not immune because they were privileged and chosen. So he uses these example of the chosen people of Jews who, despite their position, their privileges, were still punished in a sense by God for their many sins. And Paul is going to list that out as a historical reference that's on record, and he says that record is there to educate us who are living in the future, and especially us as Christians. So Paul resumes his former argument from chapter 8. He took a little break into another subject in chapter 9. Now he's going back to that argument from chapter 8 about eating food offered to idols. And he shows us that it's utterly inconsistent with true believers, true Christ followers. It's not something that Christians can do. It's not just, you have a choice. No, you really don't. He says that is idolatry, to eat what was offered to idols. And it is joining into a relationship, as he says, with demons. I know that sounds extreme. And he says that relationship with demons cannot coexist with having a relationship with God or with Jesus Christ. And that will come up in verses 15 through 22. Paul allows that while they must not eat food sacrificed to idols as such, and out of any regard to the idol, they can legitimately eat such food or meat from the markets or eat it at the table of a pagan neighbor without any hesitations or without asking questions, really. You know, it's not up to the Christians in Corinth to question their neighbors if they set food before them. It says, because the pagans' use of the food did not leave the food unfit to be eaten by God's servants. So it's kind of a catch-22, and we'll get there in the explanation. And because he says, still, liberty of this kind has to be used with due regard for those Christians, Christ followers, who are still weak in their conscience. They're still not to be considered spiritually mature. They're considered spiritual infants in that regard. So he says, don't give offense to the Jews or the Gentiles who have converted over to be Christ believers who are still spiritually immature, nor to the church of God. And that will be verses 23 through the end of the chapter. So let's take them section by section. Verses 1 through 5. In order to advise the Corinthians against communion with idolaters and self-confidence in the freedom to make sinful choices, Paul gives them the example of the Jews, God's chosen ones of the Old Testament covenant. The chosen ones, the Jews, enjoyed great privileges. They were God's receivers of God's benefits in that regard. Still, when they were guilty of scandalous behavior, they suffered serious consequences. In these verses here, Paul totals up their privileges, which are the same for the Christians and ultimately ours as well. So Paul introduces his instruction with a note of regard. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters. Paul wants them to know that his instruction will be worthy of their attention. So it's kind of like saying, hey, write this down. If you're at a lecture or something, the teacher, whoever it is, might say, you probably want to write this down. This is important. You're going to need to remember this. But he's already written it for them. He says, I don't want you to be ignorant. Paul considers Judaism, as well as Christianity, to be under a veil of sorts, wrapped up in signs, miracles, hints. He says that the gospel was preached to the Jews in their legalistic rituals and sacrifices. The gospel was preached to us in Jesus' parables and miracles and hints, if you will. So he's teaching that God's providence and the consequences for sin can also be lessons for the Corinthians and for us. Paul specifies some of their privileges. He begins with their deliverance from Egypt, so to speak, and the Jewish, literally, the Corinthians, figuratively, as a learning tool. Paul says, our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. For them, the meaning of being under the cloud in this usage is positive, not negative. Like we may use the phrase today, my life is under a cloud, and we're talking about, the bad things that are happening to us, or, whatever is going on. We're like, I feel like I'm under a black cloud. Well, they were under God's divine leadership and protection and supervision. For them, the cloud was positive. It was a sign from God. So the cloud served two purposes. It sometimes formed into a cloudy pillar, shiny on one side to show them the way, dark on the other side to hide them from their pursuing enemies. And sometimes the cloud spread itself over them as a mighty sheet to defend them from the burning sun in the sandy desert. You can find a reference to this in Psalm 105, verse 39. You can see that in the resource page. They were miraculously guided through the Red Sea, where the pursuing Egyptians were drowned. So it's safe passage to them and a grave to their pursuers. They were very dear to God, as God's chosen. So God would work miracles for their deliverance and take them under his guidance and his protection, literal guidance with the cloud guiding them through the dry land, through the Red Sea and through the wilderness. So in a sense, they had sacraments. Not the same as us, not exactly the same, but not all that dissimilar either. They were all baptized into Moses, so to speak, in the cloud and in the sea. That's verse 2. Paul's words, okay? So we need to understand, baptized into Moses. We know about being baptized into Christ, but Moses? So he is saying they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. That is, they were all under obligation to God and Moses' law and the old covenant or the old agreement. Covenant in the sense of an agreement, a contract, if that's better language for you. Try to go with what works for your mindset here. And that's the same as referencing as us being baptized under a Christian baptism, or in that sense, a new covenant, a new agreement. Like Jesus will say of Holy Communion, this is the new covenant in my blood. Okay, those words should be familiar to you if you're partaking of Christian Holy Communion. So Paul also says they all ate of the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. So that's not unlike or not dissimilar to our version of eating the bread and drinking the wine. The manna which they ate was a type of Christ crucified, not Jesus necessarily, but the sense of the universal Christ or the godly Christ, okay? Using it in those terms, the Messiah in the Jewish language. So the bread which came down from heaven was a sense of Christ crucified, which brought them life from God. It was a special gift from God. You can find that story yourself in the Old Testament, but the manna from heaven, they were only allowed to collect enough for one day. If they tried to collect more than just one day's worth, it rotted. There's a whole story about that I did not share in the resource page. You can read that on your own. So their drink then was a stream pouring out of the rock, which followed them all the way through their journey in the wilderness. And this rock, Paul says, was Christ. That is, it was a type of or a figure of Christ. Not necessarily the same way we think of Jesus, the manifestation of God in the flesh, but a type of Christ. Like we would say, Christ is the rock on which the Christian church is built. Does that mean Christ was a literal rock? No, it's a metaphor. So Paul's also saying the streams of living water came from Christ, so that all the believers drank and were refreshed. Despite the blessings and spiritual nourishment, Paul says, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness, in verse 5. Paul is pointing out that some people can enjoy many and great spiritual privileges in this world and still fall short of eternal life. Many of those Jews or chosen ones whose bodies were left scattered in the wilderness were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. That is, they had their faith in Moses' divine commission confirmed by God's miracles, and they were still defeated by sin. in the wilderness, and they never saw the promised land. Paul does not want any Christ follower to presume too much based on our great privileges. The privileges we receive will not secure our place in heaven. They are privileges in this world. They also will not prevent consequences for sin here on earth. We do have consequences for our choices. And sometimes when we choose badly, we suffer consequences badly. Now, verses 6 through 14. Paul, having listed out their privileges, now gives an account of their sins and the consequences, which are recorded as an example to us, a warning, so that we do not make bad choices. We do not commit similar sins if we would want to escape the similar consequences. So we must not do as they did, so we do not suffer as they suffered. Paul lists out their sins as cautions to us. We should not set our hearts on evil things as they did. Verse 6. God fed them with the manna, bread from heaven, and they complained that they did not have meat and should have stayed in Egypt. Numbers 11, verse 4. You can see that in a resource page. So now we are witnessing or seeing the carnal or fleshly desires which are coming out of them. They had plenty of manna in the wilderness, and after so long it was like, we need meat, we need meat. Their desires grow bolder through indulgence. And therefore, Paul's saying they should be restrained when they first come up. Give an inch, take a mile, as the old saying goes. So when the initial temptation goes unchecked, we cannot know where these temptations will lead us. This caution comes first, because once a carnal or fleshly appetite is indulged, it starts to take root, and it becomes a source of more and greater sin. If we think we can get away with something, we'll try to get away with a little bit more. That's the warning here in plain and simple terms. So Paul strongly warns against idolatry in verse 7. He says, do not be idolaters, as some of them were, the Jews that is. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. What's he talking about? Paul refers to the sin of creating and worshiping the golden calf found in Exodus chapter 32, verse 6. They first sacrificed to their idol, then they feasted on the sacrifices, and then they danced before the idol. The only eating and drinking are mentioned here, the sacrifice is implied. The apostle is speaking to the case of the Christians in Corinth who were tempted to feast on the pagan sacrifices. Again, going back to chapter 8 and eating of the foods that's offered to idols. They do not seem to have been under any temptation to offer the sacrifice themselves, yet they are tempted, and some have been, eating of the food in sacrifice to the idols. They're trying to draw a distinction of saying, well, I didn't actually sacrifice to the altar, I just ate with those other people. Well, even eating and drinking of the sacrifice before the altar, that is, in worship, and as such sacrificed, was idolatry, which by example of the Israelites, they should be warned to avoid. It will have negative consequences. Then Paul turns to another form of explaining this. In verse 8 he says, we should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. What does that have to do with eating food offered to idols? Well, Paul is warning here against fornication, sexual immorality, a sin to which some of the inhabitants of Corinth, if not all, were in a particular manner addicted. They became addicted to this kind of fornication. I've talked about it before. We called it temple prostitution, part of the form of worship for some of those pagan temples. And Corinth had a temple dedicated to Venus. Venus is considered to be the goddess of love, or lust, really, with more than 1,000 priestesses belonging to that temple in Corinth. And for all intents and purposes, it was common knowledge that they were prostitutes in the temple. Therefore, it was necessary, Paul thinks it was necessary, to warn against this kind of fornication, this kind of sexual immorality for those who lived in such a corrupt city. How far of a step is it to participate in the temple prostitution if one has already been tempted and has succumbed to idolatry, that is, eating the food that was offered to idols and doing it along with the worshipers in that temple? That kind of thing is where we get a statement about giving an inch and taking a mile. Spiritual prostitution in worshiping idols did in many cases lead to bodily prostitution. So if the worshipers were giving in to the eating of the food that was offered to idols in the worship of the idols, the next logical step then would be participating in the bodily prostitution. Oh, what could it hurt? Kind of, the temptation. Did God really say to you? Kind of thing, like the serpent did to Adam and Eve. Most of the small g gods whom the pagans served were represented artistically. That is, by examples of what today we might call pornography. Many obscenities were committed in the very worship of many of these pagan gods. Many of the Jewish writers and many Christians after them think that such worship was given to Baal Peor, and that fornication was committed with the daughters of Moab in the worship of that idol. Some Jews were enticed by these women, both to spiritual and bodily prostitution. First, to feast on the sacrificial food, and then to defile themselves with sexual acts within the temple. And you can read about that on your own in Numbers chapter 25. I did not put the whole chapter on the resource page. You'll have to look it up yourself. Part of the consequences of the sin, of course, which was it brought on a plague. There are sexually transmitted diseases. You probably learned about those in school. I know I did 100 years ago. So STDs, a plague they would have called that in one day killed 23,000 people, besides those who fell by the hand of public justice. That's a warning from Paul. Paul warns we should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes, in verse 9. I will confess to you, I avoid all snakes, because I do not know. I cannot tell the difference between what's venomous and not venomous. Hesitate now. Don't put in the comments how I can tell. I don't care. I'm just going to avoid all snakes. I don't need you to teach me which ones are venomous, I promise. I'm just going to avoid them all. Paul states that Christ was with God's chosen ones in the wilderness. Christ was the angel of the covenant or agreement who went before them, and that Christ was greatly grieved and provoked by them in many ways. They spoke against him and Moses, asking, "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" For which reason God sent the fiery snakes among them. You can read about that in Numbers chapter 21, verses 5 and 6. I did put those two verses on the resource page. Paul warns them against complaining. He says in verse 10, "Do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel." They argued with God. They grumbled against Moses, God's minister, whenever difficulties arose among them. We don't do that, right? Things get bad and we start complaining against God. That was my eye roll, if you couldn't tell. When they met with discouragements on the way to the promised land as they wandered through the wilderness, they were apt to complain. Surprise! And they were apt to blame their leaders, especially Moses, for relocating them. You took us out of Egypt. They forgot how bad it was in Egypt, and they were very nostalgic about the fact that they had food to eat and a place to live. Now they're wandering in the wilderness. They had a desire to go back, nostalgically, believing it wasn't all that bad. And they complain against the leadership of the others, the Moses and the others. That was all of their own choosing. They chose to go with Moses, and now they're complaining because they did. Something like this seems to have been the case with the Christians in Corinth. They grumbled against Paul, and through him against Christ. And apparently they were choosing other teachers who ostensibly would indulge them, who would soothe them by telling them what they wanted to hear or by giving in to their desires. And in particular, a rebellion against Paul, which was leading to idolatry. And such contact was very provoking to God. It was likely going to bring them swift negative consequences, as it did on the Israelites. This is all the warning coming from Paul. You can see about consequences in Numbers 14, verse 37, which I put on the resource page as well. So Paul adds to these particular cautions a more general one. In verse 11, he says, "These things happened to them as examples and were written down as a warning for us." It's history repeating itself. And he's saying, you had this warning of what they did during the wilderness wandering, and you need to take that seriously because history is about to repeat itself. Not only the laws and commandments of the Jews, but also the blessings of God toward them. This is history repeating itself. Their sins against God and backsliding from God's word were typical of the kind of unfaithfulness of many who were called to the gospel and called to live under the rule of the law of Christ, as Paul says. And their exclusion from an earthly promised land for the Jews typified the exclusion of many under the gospel out of the heavenly promised land for their unbelief. Jewish history was written, Paul is telling them and us, to be a lasting example to the church, even until the last and the perfect conclusion, Paul says, on whom the culmination of the ages has come, the concluding period of God's government over the believers on this world. Paul wants us to understand nothing in Scripture is written in vain. God shows wise purposes for us by leaving us the Jewish historical record, and it is our responsibility to learn from their mistakes. Okay? People often wonder, why should I read the Old Testament? It just seems like a lot of stuff that I don't need to know. Well, history has a lot of stuff we need to know because we don't want to repeat the past mistakes. Paul issues a plain word of caution in verse 12. If you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Don't repeat the mistakes of the Jews in the wandering of the wilderness. Learning from other people's mistakes shows wisdom. How well do you learn from other people's mistakes? That's what Paul is saying. The caution is to realize that if others have fallen, we can too. We're not that much better than them that we can't learn from their mistakes, that we'd never be tempted to fall as they did. Oh yeah, we will. As soon as you try to admit that, here comes the devil saying, really? Let's see about that. We are most likely to fall when we are most confident of our own strength and most likely to be caught off guard. Paul follows his word of caution with a word of comfort in verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to everyone. It is displeasing to God for us to presume self-righteousness or self-importance. It is also displeasing to God for us to fall into despair. We live in a world filled with temptations, and we can be tripped up at any place and at any time. Every place, condition, relation, employment, and entertainment can provide temptations. The temptations that the Christians face are temptations that everyone faces. What others have been able to face and walk away from, we can too. And I'm just noticing I'm running over my time. Well, I will apologize for that. And I'm going to pause there with some positivity, at least a little bit. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to everyone. Paul is saying, don't think it's hopeless. Okay? We can avoid temptation. We just need to be aware of it. Thanks for joining me here again this week. I did mention it's still cold. I actually picked this up on our tour of Alaska. So I have my Alaskan warmth on today. It's colder here than it is in Alaska. Thanks for joining me here again today. If you're in the Sun City Center area on Sunday at 10 a.m., please feel welcome to join us in person for worship at Redeemer. If you can't be here in person, you can join us as we live stream 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings, or you can pick that up as a recording later if you wish to watch it later in the week. I hope you're having a great week. Take care, stay warm, God bless.